Like, it is what it is. Um,
It's
let's talk about bitterness.
He's like, I'm out.
Okay, ease out. Well,
I thought this was going to be about me.
so juxtaposition aside there, um, when I was praying about what message to do, because, tonight was supposed to be like a potluck type of thing. And then we all got shut down again. And technically, it is what it is. It's all like
At least we're not going to jail.
right, we would have done it anyways
Yes, we would have.
if anybody showed up.
We would have put the cops in jail.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
We can do that, right?
See?
Cops in
Yeah.
jail. Yeah. Anyway, fittingly, God having the sense of humor that He does, we would have had this potluck and everything for having everybody come over for, like a community meal, and then we would have talked about bitterness.
Because that is how we do.
That's how we do. Yeah. So let's just dive into it. The thing about it is that the Bible doesn't have a ton about bitterness specifically. There's a lot about unforgiveness, and oftentimes the two are very much so intertwined, but they're not always the same thing. Okay, you can be unforgiving of somebody and not be bitter at them. Like, to give an example of that, you can have a circumstance where you have not forgiven somebody, but you don't dwell on it. You don't think about it. It's like you've dismissed them from your mind because they're not a person to you anymore. Or more precisely, they're not a part of your life anymore. You just cut them out and they're gone. They're done. You're finished. The relationship is over and you will have nothing more to do with them. And even if they try to make amends, no, you will not have anything to do with them. They're cut out and gone entirely. Whereas you can also be bitter at at a circumstance. See, bitterness doesn't just revolve around a person. Okay, you can be bitter for a lot of different reasons. We typically in church, especially in the groups that every group that I've ever worked with, it's a lot of people who are bitter at the church specifically. I've been that more than enough times myself. It's an easy thing to do. But you can be bitter about a lot of different things. And rather than repeat myself again, I'll explain that. You can be bitter about being sick. You can be bitter about your life circumstance, the way that you always feel like you're getting rolled by situations, the way that nothing ever works out for you. And then oftentimes those people, when you're in that position, you get bitter at God or resentful for that greater, because at some points it feels like, it inevitably it starts to seem less coincidental and like there is a power that's working against you. And I say that from experience. My early 20s, my whole life, honestly. But I didn't really give my life to Jesus entirely until my late teens, early 20s. And I wasn't close to God. Now, for anybody, if you know me, you know that I talk about having a relationship with God, knowing Him personally. I'll tell people things that God's told me, just in whether it's in conversations that we have or words that He specifically gives me for the person as in front of me. But at that point in time, that wasn't a thing. I was like most Christians, most people in general. My relationship with God revolved around the time that I spent reading the Bible or the time that I spent praying, you know, devotional prayers. It wasn't a. People get upset about me saying it this way, but it's not meant to be disrespectful. It wasn't a real relationship. It was devoted, but it wasn't close. It wasn't intimate. God wasn't necessarily real. He was, he was this kind of figure who I knew existed, but at the same time, I couldn't entirely
Like you
say.
just saw him at the staff meeting once a week.
Right. Like I could feel his presence at times during worship and things like that,
Yeah.
but he wasn't he wasn't a father.
Yeah.
He was just out there in the ether, as it were. But the thing about it was that like in that time, those were some of the hardest times of my life in terms of just trying to make ends meet.
Yeah.
I was always working and never able to get ahead. I wanted to get my degree and I was going to college and I never had enough money. And I'd work and I never had enough money. And I'd constantly having, I was surviving off of church food boxes and I had every month I had to make a decision between electricity and car insurance in terms of which one was getting paid with the little bit of money I had left over after I paid rent. They were hard times. And I was stuck. Got my heart broken by a girl that I was in love with. It was just an incessant mess. And after a while, it started to feel personal. It stopped being a matter of, it's going to get better one day. A year, 2 years into it, it's just like, this isn't getting better. And God, why don't you have my back? Where are you? So I prayed harder and tried to be more perfect, and as though I was going to earn, the benefit, as though I was going to earn the benefits of God's love and His care, as though I was going to have Him like draw closer. He was going to do better, nice things for me because I was being a better Christian, and that didn't work either, which only inspired a greater degree of resentment, because I didn't understand at that time that it's not about transactions. See, God's favor is not transactional. God's love is not transactional. And this is really confusing for us because we live in a very transactional society. And that's what the thing about relationship with God is, that it's very, very, very hard because He's a very different entity than what we're accustomed to. There's a massive learning curve, and it's easy to not understand Him, and it's even easier to get really bitter with Him. So, using that as an example, that's an example of how you can just become bitter at things other than, God is something you can become bitter at. Other people, the church, circumstances, work. You can get working at a customer service is infamous for inspiring bitterness and hopelessness in the face of the human race. If you work in customer service or have worked in customer service, you will oftentimes find yourself believing the worst about people because your experiences tell you the worst about people is true. There's a reason why a good portion of this year was spent with people, making memes about Karens. I've worked at customer service, I've worked at the grocery store. I have my own stories. But that's off topic. And the thing of it is that when we talk about bitterness, we have to kind of acknowledge things, and we have to acknowledge the reality that a lot of it comes from inside of us. It's an emotional, it's a natural emotional response to something that hurts us. See, and we'll get to this, we'll unpack this a little bit more in a moment, and even like where it's even referred to in the Bible. Bitterness is the emotional response that comes from facing opposition to us in life, and especially painful stuff. It's almost like we develop these chips on our shoulders. We develop this kind of coldness. We'll galvanize our heart in order to try to protect it. And a lot of the way that we do that, and there are a lot of different ways that we do it, but in the case of bitterness, since that's our topic at hand, what we end up doing is we try to harden ourselves in a way against that threat, against that danger. And in that, we're going to protect ourselves. It's a subconscious mindset that we carry forward. I'm going to harden myself against this. But the problem with bitterness specifically is that it's consuming. Like I said at the beginning, the difference between, unforgiveness and bitterness and the way that they cannot interact is that a lot of unforgiveness, you can have a lot of different responses, whereas bitterness is very consuming. See, it doesn't leave your mind that this hurt you. It never gets dismissed. What you run into is varying levels of feeling that thing being there. It's like a thorn in your flesh, something that just stabs you in the side. It's like a puncture in between your ribs. So when you move a certain way, you'll feel it. But if you sit or rest in a certain way, you won't even notice it's there. It's not until you make that movement that you feel the pain of it. And bitterness is very much like that. I'll give an example in terms of like my own life, and I could give so many, but in my interactions with the church, one of the ones that comes to mind is this old church that I was a part of. And I've never really been able to get away from them, not yet. So, because it comes back up all the time. But it was this church that I was a part of for a few years, and it's where I met my wife. And Heather and I, we met there. We had a lot of mutual friends there, and they turned on us. And long story short, they turned on us, they hurt us, and then they projected on us for the kind of the crimes of one of their own pastors. It was easier to focus on us, who didn't do what he had done with another member of their congregation. And yet we had to get crucified for that. And naturally that inspired a lot of bitterness, a lot of reasons to be bitter, a lot of unforgiveness even. Because of course it did.
It hurt.
And the thing of it is that like there are times when I don't really think about it. But then suddenly something will pop up and that'll remind me of one of the three leaders, or one of the people, or one of the messages that was given, one of the things that stuck with me. There are a lot of different things like that, little triggers that will once again proc that wound, and suddenly you're left remembering this thing. And what's more is it changes your attitude. See, because bitterness doesn't go away, because it's something that lingers there with you, you can't You can't let it go because it won't release you. It's the same kind of thing that happens with like an anxiety disorder where something gets into your head and you can't let it go. You have to deal with it. You obsess over it. Bitterness is like that, muted in a way, but it's there nonetheless, and it inspires a reaction from you. And what's more, is it'll cause discongruity inside of your person, inside of your character. You will change as a result of your bitterness. And that's not a question, that's not something that's debatable, it's not something that we look at and say, well, I will overcome that. It will happen. Every time. There is not a person alive who has bitterness towards others and is the same person they were before that hit. A lot of people believe they are. Our pride makes us stand back and try to pretend that we are the same person, that we're not actually affected by the thing that we're bitter about. But that's delusional. That's something that's a bias that we have to work to confirm. And I say that from experience because I've done that more than enough times. A verse that I was given pertaining to this is out of Hebrews 12, verses 14 through 17. And there's we'll unpack why it's pertinent in just a moment. The writer of Hebrews writes, "Make every effort to live in peace with everyone and to be holy. Without holiness no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one falls short of the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. See that no one is sexually immoral, or is godless like Esau, who for a single meal sold his inheritance rights as the oldest son. Afterward, as you know, when he wanted to inherit this blessing, he was rejected. Even though he sought the blessing with tears, he could not change what he had done." Like, we could do a whole sermon about this message, about what's being said here in general, but I'm going to take it back to that point they make in verse 15. "See to it that no one falls short of the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many." Now, there are a few different translations that say other things. I like the NIV's use of the word bitter root. Others say bitterness, others say, become bitter. The thing about the bitter root and why that's preferred is because that's what it effectively becomes a thing. There's an old poem that's about a poison tree, and it talks about the concept of bitterness and the idea that you're going to, or wrath to a lesser extent. And oftentimes we go back to that analogy because with bitterness it is very much so something that roots itself inside of you and spreads. The the plant that grows from it is a snarled collection of thorny vines that covers our entire character and chokes it out. As that root grows and spreads inside of us, growing to every system, everything that it can reach, and changing it, sucking out the joy and the compassion. It defiles many in the sense that it's so easy to become bitter. It's so incredibly easy to give in to that, especially when you're in the face of opposition all the time, especially when you're in the face of people who have hurt you. And hurt goes, and there's a spectrum of ways that people can hurt you. Some people, it's the long over time little pecks, little things that happen over years and years and years. And they affect you and drain you and wear you down. And even though you rally after 10 years, you've been pecked and pecked and pushed and prodded and pecked and pecked and pecked, and you just find yourself worn down and believing the worst because your bitterness has gotten the best of you. Others, it's a single circumstance or many big circumstances. I can think of one guy I actually just talked to earlier via Facebook. We had a dispute, but I try to be merciful with him because I know what he went through. And he was a pastor of a church, and he was rejected by the congregation the moment he stepped foot in there because they liked the old pastor better. Even though the old pastor retired, it's almost like they were crucifying him for the act of replacing their beloved pastor. But it got to a point where when they made everything hard for him. And when his wife had a miscarriage, they informed him that it was because of his unrighteousness. That kind of stuff, like, that's not okay. Number one, it's not okay. It's not acceptable. There's nothing holy or righteous about that. There's no point where Jesus is going to stand back, look at that, and say, well, you did the good thing there. It's never going to happen. But my poor friend has had to carry that, the pain of that. Not only the loss, but the utter and complete betrayal and dehumanization that he suffered as a result of those people, and just how incredibly alone they left him and his wife to feel. And bitterness is easy. See, the danger with bitterness, the reason why we're doing a message on bitterness, the reason why God gave it to me as something to talk about specifically, explicitly, is because bitterness is so easy to justify. They hurt me, so it's right for me to feel this way. This situation is this hard, which means I'm right to feel this way. See, it plays on the need that we have to be angry, to be hurt, to grieve the pain, or to process the rage that we feel. It's when things are unfair and we're powerless in the face of them. That's not okay. And it's okay to feel that they're not okay. It's okay to express that it's not okay. But there comes a point where we have to let it go. And that's where bitterness comes in, because it draws that line in the sand. It's when we take and we draw that, when we come to that line and we say, okay, do we let this go or do we hold on to this? Well, I was wronged, so I should hang on to this. I want to never feel this again. I want to never have this happen again. So it's what we do. We get bitter. We subconsciously hold on to this and keep it with us forever and ever and ever. And we do it because we feel we're going to protect ourselves. And that's not what happens. The grim reality of what happens in the face of bitterness is that we've just become more bitter. See, it eats at us from the inside, but more than that, new circumstances will arise. See, being bitter doesn't preserve you in any way, shape, or form. In fact, it makes you more vulnerable. to the pain and suffering that come from other people or other circumstances being just as bad. It weakens our core instead of protecting it. In that verse, it uses the word defiles many. And it's a good way to put it. Defile is to corruption as potato is to potato. We oftentimes have to consider the reality that, we tend to put connotations about sin in there. And there is sin that follows in the wake of this, but it's not about sin per se. It's about how far we move in our hearts away from God. And yeah, if you saw the last message and kind of like talking about sin, that is sin. But it's not the kind that we think of. We always associate sin with being damned because we're doing some irreparable act of unrighteousness that's going to drive a wedge between us and God. Driving a wedge between us and God comes from our hearts. Okay? If I slip up and, man, I don't know.
So bitterness is like the gateway drug
Yeah. Yeah.
to whatever you just said.
Yeah. Bitterness is a good gateway drug to dividing us from God.
Yeah.
Yeah. If I slip up and I look at some porn or something like that, yeah, that's bad. Like that's not an okay thing. If I slip up and like condemn one of the people around me, or throw a fist into my neighbor's eye because he was being a dick. Say dick during a sermon.
Oh, that's not what my face was. That's right.
All of these things.
They start as something smaller.
Right. All of these things are examples, but they will not create a wedge between me and God. Mm-hmm. Just like with anybody watching this, those things are not going to drive a wedge between you and God. Okay? They could start it, they could help it, but that is not where the wedge comes from. Your singular act is not it. It's the distance between your hearts. And bitterness is something that affects your heart and afflicts it.
And causes you to push away.
Exactly. Just as Heather put it, it causes you to push away. Because God is always going to come seeking reconciliation, seeking love, seeking peace and harmony, seeking joy. And don't think for a moment that doesn't mean there might not be war or anything like that. Sometimes the path to peace and harmony is bloody. Mm-hmm. Okay? And God knows when to lead us through that. Mm-hmm. But just in case somebody wants to quote, God is a God of war or some other crap like that. He has his purpose behind it. And his purpose is always towards reconciliation. Jesus came to save the world in John 13, as he expresses in John 3. And that in order to reconcile the world, sometimes things get messy. Sometimes that bitterness has to be vented. Sometimes it has to be brought up to the surface in order for it to finally be let go. But it's important that it is. And sometimes that's going to be messy, scary, problematic, and sometimes they're just going to make it worse. And at that point, it's incumbent on us to let it go. Take it upon ourselves to say, I'm going to drop this. Because we have to. It'll drain us, it'll wear us down, it'll break us, and it'll keep us away from God. Because it's us looking at God, and where he's saying, I need you to let this go, we're saying no. They hurt me. They did this. They did this bad thing. Hurt them for me. And God says no. And we get so angry at him. Suddenly our bitterness turns on him too. Assuming that he wasn't the focal point of our bitterness to begin with. In those instances, that's a whole other thing. That's a conversation that looks a bit more like, you did this to me,
And so I'm gonna do this.
so I'm gonna not hang out with you. I'm gonna spite you. I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do that, or I'm not gonna talk to you. He doesn't let it go. I promise. I've been there. I know. I've been that person so many times, and he does not leave you alone. And he's patient, and that's actually more annoying when you're angry at him. The thing of it is that this doesn't help us. Collectively, as individuals, as people, bitterness doesn't actually serve a purpose of anything in any way, shape, or form validating or serving us in a way that's beneficial. It's actually it's a corruption of seeking justice. It basically comes from a place of accepting that we will never find justice and choosing to instead be angry about it. A lot of little idioms that we throw around say things to the effect of, bitterness is like swallowing poison and waiting for somebody else to die. That's not wrong. Like, there's a reason why these old idioms float around the way they do. Because there's a wisdom to them. And that's valid. Bitterness doesn't change anything. Bitterness doesn't help anything. It just causes us to sit there and nurse our wounds. It's like a sliver buried deep in our skin. And we could pull it out, but we don't want to. Because it could hurt worse to pull it out.
Yeah.
And what's more is you might get another sliver.
Yeah.
And we have to learn to be okay with suffering, with facing the realities of people hurting us. And that's a hard thing to say, and that's more of a hard thing to it's more of a hard thing to hear. But see, the antithesis of bitterness, I would argue, is bravery. And a lot of us don't really understand how bravery works. We have these weird definitions, like bravery is being strong in the face of fear. It's not having fear. Bravery is completely being afraid, but choosing to do what you need to do anyways. And in the case of this particular topic, it's choosing to forgive those who will never apologize to you, who don't even remember that they hurt you. It's choosing to forgive them. It's choosing to let that pain go, knowing fully and entirely well that you'll probably get hurt again. It might not be the same people. It might not be the same circumstance. It may be years down the road, but it will happen again. It's just the nature of this thing.
It'll present itself again to you.
It will present itself again to you, but more than that.
Decide differently that time. Yeah.
True. But the other side of it is it's inevitable. People will hurt us. Circumstances will not always go our way. And it has nothing to do with your level of righteousness or anything like that. It has nothing to do with your relationship with God.
How well you handle pain.
Right. You will have things happen again. Jesus puts it well when he says, I can promise that you will find trouble in this life. The man said it himself, guys. I don't know why we like to pretend otherwise. We want to be comfortable. We want to have harmony. We want to have tranquility. This world is never going to allow that. All the demons and that Satan leads, they're never going to allow that. And the people that wittingly or unwittingly follow them or serve them or are even tricked by them are never going to allow that.
I have a question
Yeah.
about bitterness. So, you know how you said that like bitterness doesn't let you go.
Right.
How do you how do you break up with it? I guess.
We'll get there.
Okay.
Yeah. This is part of it, honestly. So the thing of it is that understanding that it's going to happen again, we're left with a decision to make. If I'm bitter about the church, for example, which I probably am a little bit, but I know that God has called me into working with the church. I'm going to be there. I'm left with a decision to make, and that's that I can either maintain and hold on to my bitterness. Oh yeah, and walking away is off the table because I decided that. Okay.
There's no
So
way to walk away from it. Yeah.
you can't walk away from who you are, no matter how hard you try. You will find your way back one way or the other over and over again. Done it. But you're left with a decision to make about what you're going to do with that. So me being bitter with the church, I have the decision to make. I'm going to be there with the church. I can either maintain my bitterness, and that will actually, it'll corrupt me gradually over time. It'll make me more bitter. It'll make me more prickly, for lack of a better word, towards those. It'll make me more distrustful, more spiteful. And what's more is it will affect my message, because I will perpetuate that bitterness to other people. I might not even mean to. Like, I might be very much so trying to control how I speak and what I say. But the inference, my character, how I feel about these things will get projected into the messages. It will get projected into the way that other people perceive them. I will not always be able to hide it, and I will not always have control over that. So other people will be affected. What God gives me to share will be affected by the flavor, by the flavor that I am putting out there. The level of salt that is attached to that message will either be something that people enjoy because it makes it delicious, or it'll burn the hell out of their mouths and possibly poison them. Or I can choose to let it go. See, bitterness won't let you go, but you can let it go. Because ultimately there's a decision there that we make. And, it's not a matter of taking control of ourselves and our circumstance. It's not a matter of like saying, okay, well, I'm going to choose not to be bitter anymore. I'm going to focus on the positive. That doesn't actually work. Like, there are some people who will force it. There are some people who are capable of forcing it. Like, they find a way, focusing on the good works for them. Then there are lots more people who are faking it and trying to make it. And they will fail. And then there are other people, I'm one of these people, who can't even fake it. Like, you don't have it in you. It's just grating to try. It's the kind of thing where you like start it You try it, and then you realize very quickly that you can't do it, and you just stop trying to do it because it's just a waste of time.
It just feels fake. Yeah.
Our path forward here when it comes to bitterness and letting it go does actually come back to God. And see, a lot of us don't appreciate how important our will is to him. See, when we look at God, we think that we have to like make ourselves good enough for him. We have to we have to make it happen for him. We have to overcome our sins for him. That's not even like remotely biblical, okay? Like the gospels talk about, the value of the Holy Spirit, about God, walking with us and doing this stuff with us and so on. And that's where we sit, and we take that for granted, and like the power of God to change our hearts and minds and souls. And who do you think is going to take the root of bitterness out of your heart and all the little like rootlets and that system has created? It's not you. I mean, you could painstakingly pick at your psyche and try to find every little thing, and you will miss some.
Oh yeah.
And sometimes you just won't be able to take out that root. Ultimately, where we find ourselves is needing to look to God in this particular circumstance. And when you're bitter at God, that's really hard. And yet it's also the easiest thing to do. And to kind of like unpack that a little bit, what I mean is that it's hard for us to reach out to him when we're angry at him, but it's the easiest thing to do, in the sense that once we do it, it takes the whole weight and burden off of our shoulders. Because in the end, if you're angry at God in that way, it's because you actually want to be close to him.
Yeah.
And oftentimes that's what makes you so angry, is feeling like you're not good enough, feeling like you're not valued, feeling unwanted, feeling rejected, feeling abandoned, when all you want is to be close, to know him. In many cases, that's where we sit.
And even if you feel like the bad guy, God still knows deep down that your true heart just wants him.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's where will is really important. Because even though you might not be able to overcome this on your own, the will to is what's important. If you really want it to be different, God will change it. Like, it's not it's the kind of thing where our will being set on this thing is something that God will appreciate. And if it's something that stands between the two of you, he will do it. It might not, and I always say that kind of thing, knowing that I'm speaking, what the Spirit has given me, but also understanding that it's important to stop and express the point that there's no time frame on that, okay?
That's, yeah.
Like, whenever somebody says, well, if you feel this way, if you want this to be different, go to God and he will change it, we always take that to mean that it's an immediate transaction. And it's not. It's not always that. Sometimes, sure. You just go to God, say, God, I don't want to be bitter anymore. Can you please change it? And suddenly, this crazy healing thing that happens. More often, it's a slower process. Because, see, when we've become bitter, it's the kind of corruption It's the kind of defilement, it's the kind of thing where it doesn't go away overnight because it's become a part of us. And oftentimes, when something has become a part of our identity, it has to be removed kind of piecemeal. And yeah, God can do all the things. Yeah, I'm telling you, I'm telling you this. Knowing his methodology, knowing him, oftentimes he will do it in piecemeal because there are parts of this that you're still in agreement with. See, you might want your bitterness gone. Okay? Like you might turn to God and your will might be entirely in the place that you want your bitterness gone. But what about the individual justifications that you have agreed with to maintain that? Well, that was unfair and that person did that and they were wrong and I'm right. Will you let that go? Well, no.
Or if you decide that, something they're doing means that they're getting away with it,
Right.
then that's another example of like an agreement
Yeah.
that you might be in.
Yeah. And in those places of agreement, that's what will stop that root from being removed. And that's why oftentimes when we go to God with bitterness, it's going to be a process because it has to come, because those agreements that we have to also be let go. And a lot of time we're not cognizant of them. Again, back to that thorn analogy, it's there, but as long as you're not moving a certain way, you're not feeling it until something triggers that. And as a result of that, there are a lot of these things that become subconscious. They become pushed into the back of our minds, and we're not really aware of them anymore. And even some of our understanding of God will actually lend itself to maintaining our bitterness. I oftentimes have to like quote scriptures and then respond. I oftentimes have to respond to the very things I say with the scriptures that people are going to quote to tell me that I'm wrong. I've been a church leader for 10 years. Does it show? I'm familiar with most of the arguments that people are going to throw at me right off the bat.
Plus, they're just human.
Plus, they are just human, yes. And what's more is, a lot of us are coming from a place of trying to understand God. And unfortunately, from that human methodology, it's a place of trying to control our understanding. See, we're trying to wrap our heads and minds around this whole concept of living with Jesus as a part of our life. And God's weird. Well, it's hard to understand. It's hard to pack something that enormous into a nice little ball that we can kind of work with. Unfortunately, a direct result of that is that oftentimes we take into this place where we start trying to control things. And that's problematic. And we don't think of it that way. We don't see it that way. I guarantee you it's what we're doing more times than not. Because we oftentimes, in order to understand something, we need to control it. It's something that we learn in science. One of the first things that you learn when conducting experiments is the development of an experiment and how you set it up with two variables and a control: independent, dependent, and control. And that's a lot of our methodology when it moves forward with anything, is trying to control all the variables to the best of our abilities in order to understand, in order to see, in order to perceive what's really going on. And as a result of that methodology, we do it to God. And it doesn't work, but as a result, we try to pull everything, and the Bible is extremely convenient as a box to try to fit God into and force him into. And as a result, our God can't be bigger than the Bible. And that's a disservice to the Holy Spirit. I promise you. God is a lot bigger than the Bible. The Bible's a good guide, but it does not constitute the fullness of God's character and person. And it certainly is never a replacement for the Holy Spirit. The Word of God, according to the Bible, is the Holy Spirit, not the Bible. So, in this kind of circumstance, with all that said, there's a place for us to understand, to recognize where God's going to move and who He is and how much bigger He is than the things that we're dealing with, and how His methods are going to be very clear because He understands what we need. And oftentimes what we need is to come out of agreement with the various things that we hold on to in order to validate the bitterness that we feel, in order to protect ourselves from the hurt that we feel. At least the way we tell ourselves, the narrative that we put out in our heads is one that effectively says, I will not go through that again. And as long as this hurt is here, I will be protected. When in reality, it will corrupt, it will damage you on the inside, in your character, and it will only hurt that much more when we face the same hurts again, because they will come. The truth is that the best way to handle this is to let it go, to give this stuff away, and to heal, so that the next time we get rocked, we're strong enough to handle it, instead of already being withered by the bitterness that we've been carrying this whole time.
And strength comes from knowing the truth. Will you recognize the truth next time? Because it's going to be just as hard. It's going to hurt just as bad.
Yeah.
But maybe next time you'll be witness to the truth.
Yeah. Yeah.
That changes us from the inside out.
Yeah. There is no strength in darkness. There are a lot of things in media and so on, in shows that we watch, that would suggest otherwise. But fear is not a strength in and of itself, and that's oftentimes what the darkness has. It's a facade. Now,
Fear or have to lose, or, any of that stuff.
right. The reality is that in darkness, we don't find strength. It's in those places of light where we can find healing, where we can be revitalized. That's where you draw strength from. And that's not just like an idiom, okay? If your body heals from damage that it suffered, it's capable of better enduring, better coping with the trauma of future problems. Your mind's no different, and your spirit's no different. That's why it's important for us to have this stuff, to take it to God and to be free of it. But we need to have a will for it, and what's more is we need to be willing to let go of the attachments. And that's what I got.